like Johnny mentioned, just my name is Marty Stevens. I'm the operations specialist with UCIP. And I've been with UCIP almost 3 years. It'll be 3 years in August. And so, but I'm just going to briefly hit on underwriting and exposure reporting. Of course, with counties, there's millions, if not collective billions of dollars in assets, and so in order for us to properly and adequately cover that, we need to know some of those exposures and those assets and go from there with it. So I am going to switch here. So this is just a little bit about me. This is my family. I've got 6 kids, ranging from 3 to 14. I graduated from Jordan High. The only reason I put that in there is because Joe McKay graduated from Jordan as well. And so, also it is it frequents the lists of the 10 worst high school mascots in the nation. Meat diggers. I hate to break it to you, Joe. Yeah, it's on there. And so. So again, I was hired by UCIP in 2016. I live in Sandy, but we have, I don't know if I'd call myself a chicken farmer. I definitely am not a chicken farmer, but we have about 50 to 55 chickens just at my house. My kids say when I go out there that's my happy place, to go out to we have chickens, yes. We have 3 roosters and 52 hens, and so, but they're not too bad. And so, I would love to have taken a selfie. That's not me, just so you guys know. But I wish that I could have taken a selfie with eggs and a chicken, but that'd be weird. And so, and then I also just coach just my kids in basketball and my son with football. So that's just a little bit about me. So let's see. So if we jump over, one thing that I do want to say is I'm just going to hit on this just briefly, and I'm not going to talk about just the rating or the financial side of risk exposures and underwriting. That's what Sonia will present. But I do want to say I'm fairly new to county government. I do have an insurance background. I was an insurance agent for about 14 years, and it is amazing to me when we talk about risk exposures and just exposure in general. If you look at this definition of potential liability issues, injury, property loss, or damage, counties, there is so much and so many services that counties provide that exposure, and they're necessary services, but there's a lot of exposure with those services that are provided. There's a lot of exposure with the amount of property. There's a lot of exposure with the amount of drivers that are on the road. But and I think that Johnny and Corby would agree. You guys do a fantastic job of managing that risk. And of course, there's always room for improvement with all of us. But as far as managing the risk, and I just, as I was sitting there, I made a quick list of some of the things, and I know that you guys would be able to mention a lot more than I have. But these are just some of the services that I thought of. You put on community events, parades. You have your EMT and ambulance services. Some have water parks. Or swimming pools, your road departments, your fire departments. There's a lot of money that's exchanging hands. There's collectively billions of dollars in property, whether it's vehicles or buildings. Fairgrounds, you do rodeos and all types of events that way. Library services, jails, of course your law enforcement, your health departments, planning and zoning. Again, thousands of drivers and county vehicles on the road, in some cases water and sewer districts, and then just the tens of thousands of employees that, especially some of the HR personnel that are over and have to handle, whether it's behavioral issues or hiring and firing or things like that. And so really are to be applauded and commended for the great work that you do in managing all of that risk and all that exposure. And so So this is just a quick definition of risk exposure. Of course, when we collect the data, so property, employees, we put that into a database, and then during that underwriting process, we see what exposure may present a little bit more risk than others, and then we go into the underwriting aspect of it. So your probability of a loss occurring, it's interesting. The probability of, say, getting hit by space junk. What would you say the probability of walking outside and getting hit by a falling piece of satellite? Very small, right? It's probably 1 in several trillion. And then you go into the probability of Corby getting cold stone tomorrow at the UAC conference. It's pretty good, right?
100%.
So that is, so there is job to do to determine that. One thing too, as you report the exposure, so vehicles and drones and things of that nature, it really helps us to be able to determine what training, because we want to help in the risk management process as well. We want to assist you in the great work that you do in training employees and helping to create a safer workplace and to prevent or risk is tough to say. Eliminating risk is removing it entirely, and counties are generally not in a position to do that with most things. And so we are definitely here, and that's where Johnny and Alex come in, is to help with that education process and the risk management process. And so if we jump in, and I know many of you are familiar with this, and you've been doing it longer than I have, but this is how we access the exposures. So exposures is the term that we use to say what you report to UCIP, what you need covered, whether it's employees, whether it's buildings, vehicles, drones, those things. So this is the UCIP webpage. So we would jump in to log in, and it'll have a drop-down box, which will be risk coordinator. Click on that, and then you find your county or entity, and then plug in your password. And it's really tough to see, but this is a great page, and I don't know how many of you utilize everything that's on this page, but there's some really good information with not only here, if you need to request a certificate, you use this. If you need information on your workers' comp policy, you can click on that link, and that'll pull up your policy. It'll pull up how you can get a certificate of coverage from WCF insurance if you are with WCF. So that's a great resource as well. Also, if you're curious about your most recent appraisal we send out an appraisal firm once every 5 years to appraise counties. So you can locate your appraisal. You can also locate a loss report. So at the beginning of every month, I will upload a loss report with all of your open claims, and I try to get that depending on where it falls, generally by the 3rd or the 4th at the latest. But if you ever need additional loss runs, if you want a 10-year, I know some of you have requested a 10-year loss run. Perhaps if you want to do some training and you want to be able to show employees or commissioners maybe where improvement could take place, feel free to contact me, and I'm more than happy to get anything that you need. Even if you want a claim, if you want a loss run with all of the animal claims, maybe if you've noticed, we've had some deer claims or something recently, I can pull up all of that. I can go back, I can go back to 1992 when UCIP was founded, and we can go back and find all those things. So feel free to use me as a resource if you ever need any loss run information or any claim information that way. And so let's see here. We've got accident reporting kits. We have your interlocal agreement. And then if you need to print off vehicle ID cards, you can go on here and print ID cards. One thing too, I think about 2 weeks ago, I got 3 calls within a 2-day period where they were having issues with logging in. And if you've ever had that, please call me and we'll see if we can figure it out. But in all 3 cases, we actually just needed to switch internet browsers, and then it worked. So in their case, I think they were on Chrome, and they needed to switch to Internet Explorer for some reason to get on. So if you ever have problems, please feel free to call me, but you may want to try a different browser. I'm not sure if Chrome has made some updates that may perhaps reset the system. I'm not sure what happened because it was 3 right in a row. But if that doesn't work, and then feel free to call me and we'll figure it out. And so.
Marty, that's the same thing that happens when you go to print off the insurance cards.
Yes.
If you use Chrome, it puts cookies in, and you have to delete the cookies before you can access that report.
Yes.
But if you use Explorer, it'll let you right in.
Explorer will let you, okay. I know we kind of beefed up our security on our website. This is probably about a year ago. And in doing that, it seemed like it created a pop-up blocker for some, where when they tried to download a loss report, nothing would happen. And what was happening is their pop-up blocker settings were any kind of pop-up or any kind of upload, it would stop it. It wouldn't allow the function to continue. So what they needed to do is remove their pop-up blocker settings. So allow pop-up for the UCIP website specifically, and then that took care of it. But so you're saying if you switch to Internet Explorer, then you haven't had a problem with that? Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. Let's see here. So that's kind of how to get there. UCIP.utah.gov, of course, has a lot of training and risk management resources, and there's a lot of good information on the website. So here is, and I wanted to touch a little bit on schedules, because I know that as you're adding a vehicle or adding a piece of road equipment or whatever you're adding, a drone, sometimes there's some sections that almost appear where they could go either way. And so I wanted to hopefully clarify some of these. You have your main menu, right here. And of course, as you go to add, you click on, on this if you want to add an ATV, and it'll pop up the information. So with an ATV, again, your ATVs, your side-by-sides, most of the time they're used for search and rescue, it seems like, but we have some that are used for your parks and rec. And yes, yeah. And so those would fall under ATV, the ATV UTV section. The only exception would be, does anybody know do you have an ATV or a UTV that's licensed for highway use or for road use? Any of you?
The ones are for EMTs that we use.
Oh, okay. In those cases, it would be best to put those under vehicles if they're driven on roads, because of course, now that it's a licensed vehicle used for highways and used for roads, now you've got a different set of insurance laws as far as personal injury protection coverage and some requirements from the state. So if you do run into that situation and they're actually driven on the roads, I would suggest putting them in vehicles, and that way we get the coverage if they're on the roads. And so. If we jump down to construction, this includes additions and remodel projects as well. So if your county is building a new building, you go into construction and you fill in the information. I know a lot of times what Johnny has recommended, if you begin a construction project or even addition or a remodel project, give Johnny a call. Because there could be, depending on how the contract is written up, you may want to, in some cases consider builder's risk policy, an actual separate policy that will cover things. And maybe some of you have dealt with that, but give Johnny a call and he can look at the contract between the county and the contractor or the builder and then just to make sure that we have adequate coverage. And so after it's done with the construction process, of course, it gets moved over to the properties side. And so if we go down here, I have good news for the drones. If any of you have added drones on, there's a lot of questions that it asks. We've eliminated about half of the questions, and so it and some of them it took some time to get that information. So really, it's just we want to know how much you paid for it, the weight, the description of the usage. Is it for search and rescue? Is it for the fire department? And we do also want to know what certificate it has. There's some designations that in registering the certificate with the FAA or the drone with the FAA that you still need to abide by. And so we do ask a question regarding that on there. But we've also, if you have questions about drones, feel free to contact us. But I've tried to, on the website, to include hover links. And so if you don't know what a certificate of authority is as it applies to a drone, or if you don't know what Section 107 is, there's a hover link to where you can find a definition of that. And so the drones schedules is a lot easier to navigate through now. Let's see, if we go down to exposures, exposures would just be your employee count, how many law enforcement officers you have. It'll even ask things if you have a skate park in your county, if you have I believe water park is on there, if you have a jail in your county, how many nurses, judges. So it'll ask a lot of exposure information. All of that exposure information is important to us. Some of it doesn't apply specifically to UCIP. It does carry over into requests from our reinsurers where they want a little bit more information on the county operations. So if you can fill out as much of the exposure information that applies to your county, that is really helpful to us. Let's see, if we jump down to mobile equipment, that's of course your road equipment, your skid steers, your forklifts. If you have a county golf course, your golf carts would all be added under mobile equipment. Let's see, your riding lawnmowers, things of that nature. If we jump down to motorcycles is pretty self-explanatory. And we do have a few. Not too many counties have motorcycles, but there are a few out there. And then payroll. We have included in the payroll schedule, when you're updating that, we've included hover links on if you want a definition of a county payroll opposed to road department payroll, or firefighter, volunteer firefighter, whatever it is, we've included hover links that will hopefully give you a little bit more information on who to include in that particular class code. Let's see, if we go down to properties is pretty self-explanatory, just adding a building or a structure. Snowmobiles, also self-explanatory. However, it does not, snowmobiles do not include snowcats. So if you've got big, snowcat, that would fall under mobile equipment rather than snowmobiles. Let's see, trailers. Sometimes there's a little bit of a confusion between mobile equipment and trailers. And the best way to kind of separate the two is because sometimes you'll have a trailer that may have a power washer on it, or there's some equipment mounted to the trailer. If that trailer is used really just to haul things, then it's obviously going to go under trailers. However, if that mobile equipment has like a tarpon trailer, or if it's one of those where it's just a generator, right? So it's on wheels, but it's attached to a generator that they haul around to different job sites. You're going to want to put those that are equipment-mounted trailers, you're going to want to put those in mobile equipment. And so, does that make sense? you know, you run into a lot of even law enforcement has them that will tell you your speed limit, and they're on a trailer. So things like that would go under mobile equipment. Even though it's got kind of a trailer platform, it's still going to be under mobile equipment.
So like, we've got one of those those big armored vehicle units that our EMT police force has. Would that be under mobile equipment or other vehicles?
Ooh, vehicles. Is it licensed for road use, for highway use?
I don't know if it is. It's obviously a little off to see if they've got a plate on it.
Oh, okay.
Like you said, if you have like a SWAT situation,
Okay.
shoot or something, but it's
Okay.
both police and our EMT group.
Okay. My guess is it would be, especially if it's licensed for road use, that you'd want to put it under vehicles. Because you run into even big snow plows. You know, sometimes you might think, well, it's a mobile equipment, right? Because it's kind of a service vehicle. It's used to, to move snow, of course. But if it's licensed for road use, and then you're always going to want to put it on vehicles.
You can drive it and it's got a plate on it. You want it under yours.
Yes, yeah. And some of your road equipment, there's, most of it's not used to drive on roads. But yeah, if it's licensed for road use, and then always put it on vehicles, even if it's a side by side. And so yeah. And vehicles include ambulances, buses, all of those things. So, and then watercraft, any boats, even jet skis, sea-doos, all those things. They're as long as they're under 26 feet in length, and then we put them under watercraft. And so, are there any questions at all on just on schedules?
Well, I usually get a question on this is the colleagues say, hey, if we take this fire truck off, how much do we save on our insurance? It doesn't say anything. I don't know. Is there a savings when they take off a piece of equipment? Is it just reducing our percentage of overall value? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Savings?
Yeah, there's kind of a flat liability rate for all vehicles. I believe, Sonia, is it 11 cents for every $1,000 worth of coverage? Is that correct?
For property?
Yeah, for property. Yeah. So if they removed a vehicle, so it's 11 cents for every $1,000 worth of coverage.
Is that annually or monthly?
That's annually. Yeah. So that's the property rate. As far as liability goes,
We're going to go over that
so Sonia,
next
okay.
presentation.
So Sonia will, okay. The nice thing is if you remove it, mid-year, we don't, we have one renewal period where we take in all of the exposures, all kind of the county's inventory list, vehicles, buildings. Whatever you have at that point, that's what we go off of. That's how we determine the member contribution. And so we are not going to use Johnny's example that he uses often. If you take, a $25 piece of equipment off of the exposure schedule, or if you add a vehicle, we are not going to continue to bill you and invoice you for every single vehicle that you add or every building that you add during the course of the year. We have the one renewal period for our property renewal, and then that's what we what we use. However, we do ask, and I'll get into it a little bit more with affirmation, just that that you stay current and up to date on the exposures. I know sometimes it's tough because you have different departments that are sending you information and trying to to make sure you have all the correct information can be difficult. And maybe your process is a little bit different. I'd be curious to hear how you guys handle, if one vehicle comes in, do you add it, or do you have, where once every quarterly you add property on? I'd be curious how some of you do that. But yeah, we do ask that you try to stay on top of it, just to to make sure it's all up to date and current with the information. Any other questions on the exposures? All right, let's see. Okay, One thing that I really want to cover more in detail is your property coverage. So this is basically what we're looking for as far as property coverage goes. And as far as your building or structure coverage, it can be anything from a grandstand or a pavilion. It could be, we have quite a few TV towers that counties have that are covered, or a greenhouse, what have you. So really any structure, even a small storage structure that you may think, well, that's rickety and it's $2,000. Our appraiser will come out and still appraise that individual storage structure, even if it's a $1,500 structure. So with the contents coverage, we have your general contents, which includes office furniture, your appliances, office supplies, all those things. And then you get into fine arts. And fine arts, do any of you have antiques on display, expensive artwork, things like that? Do you run into that?
Museums.
The museums, okay. I know you go to the Murray City building, and they have a lot of antiques that kind of build up the history of Murray City. And so one thing that you might want to keep a lookout for is with the fine arts coverage, if it exceeds $10,000, it needs to be scheduled. You need to specifically let us know that, hey, we have a piece of artwork that's $50,000. We want to know about that, because if it's not scheduled, you've got a $10,000 kind of cap on that coverage per se. And so that leads to a few other questions as far as valuation. How do you come up with a valuation of that? And we would recommend, if you do have something, a piece like that, to have it appraised so we can adequately or properly cover it as well. And so if you have those, there's not a whole lot of fine arts that are scheduled that I can think of. There's only maybe 2 or 3 counties that have that. But just keep in mind that that's there, and keep in mind that $10,000 limit on there, just that you want to be aware of that if you do have museums and things that have some more expensive or valuable items. Let's see, your miscellaneous property. That is, generally we see that in ambulances and patrol vehicles. It's property that's not necessarily, it's not mounted to, say, an ambulance. It's floating, but it's not at one location or one site always. It kind of moves around a little bit. And so that's where you'd add miscellaneous coverage. And then EDP, electronic data processing, that's just, of course, your computers, printers, monitors, all those things. The last thing that our appraiser looks at is property in the open, and that's just your signs, fences, lamp posts, flagpoles, and so when he goes out, he does an evaluation of those as well. And so let's see, if we jump on over to property appraisal information. So like I mentioned, once every 5 years, we send an appraiser out to appraise all of the buildings in the county. And he will give you guys a call first to give you a heads up, and he'll kind of work with you as the point of contact for the county. And he'll coordinate and schedule that appraisal. And so he'll go out once every 5 years, or if you have a new construction property, like Juab County, I know has a few additions that are wrapping up, and so we want to go out and appraise those buildings too. And so with an addition or new construction, we're going to go out and have an appraisal done on it. The obvious reasons are it determines building contents and property in the open values. And also, when he goes out, he will identify if the property has a boiler system. And if it's got a boiler, of course, there's some state mandated inspections that have to happen every 2 years if you've got a boiler in a property. And so we want to, we want to know about that too. So we can send CRL, who is our reinsurance company. They work with a company called Hartford Steam Boilers, and they go out and they will inspect the boiler. They'll do a state mandated inspection every 2 years on the boiler system. So that's a small part of the appraisal, but that is one aspect of it. One important thing is we want to determine if it's in a flood zone. And the appraiser has some very sophisticated technology that he can plug in to find out if it's in a flood zone. And we will indicate if it is on the appraisal sheet as well. And so if it is in a flood zone, the problem that you have is that there is, well, let's see. I'm going to jump over to this next slide and then we'll bounce back to this. So this is FEMA flood zone definition. Most of your properties are going to be either in your B, your X, or your C flood zones. If it's in a special flood hazard area, so high risk, it's under, 100-year floodplain, so it's going to flood once every 1 to 100 years. It's going to be in a flood A zone right here. And so that means that it's obviously going to flood. You see pictures here of the Salt Lake flood in '83. These are Washington County ones, of course, and then this is a flood just at the Great Salt Lake. And so, so we want to know if it's in an A flood zone, and the reason why is because there is a much higher deductible if it's in a special flood hazard area or a flood zone A. It's actually a $500,000 deductible on the building, and then another $500,000 deductible on the contents. So if you have a building that's $5 million building and you've got $2 million in contents, that deductible is going to be up $1 million before the coverage will kick in. And so, so we want to identify those properties, and the way that we do that is through the appraisal, and then we can therefore get a flood insurance quote through NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, and then we can just kind of bridge that coverage gap. And so the nice thing about UCIP coverage as it pertains to flood is if I bounce to here again, if you're in some of these 1 to 500 year floodplains, even if you have a flood, big rainstorm or runoff, and it floods that building, if it's in a B, X, or a C flood zone, what's the deductible, Corby, for flood, for outside? $1,000. Okay. So it's $1,000 regardless, even if it's not a pipe that breaks. And so, of course, there are instances where you could be in an X flood zone and you're still going to get some flooding. I know the house that I lived in for 10 years, we had a canal, and there was a big rainstorm, big June rainstorm, and there was a low spot in this canal. It got full, and it came through and created a river in our backyard, and it went down into our basement, and we are not even close to a flood zone, but it was just an isolated incident. So something like that, as long as you're not in a high-risk flood zone, the $1,000 property deductible applies. And so, but please let me know if you'd like to know, hey, is my county, do we have any A flood zones? Are there any of our structures that are in a high-risk flood area? Please give me a call and I can pull it up and let you know. And we've worked with some of you in the past on obtaining a flood insurance quote. But yeah, please let me know if you'd like to know if there are any structures in a high-risk area. And so let's see if we jump back here. The last thing, let me see how I am for time here. We have an inflation guard over the course of 5 years. Often, you could have a building cost could essentially double in 5 years, and so we don't want a shortfall of coverage if property was appraised in 2014 and it's coming up on 2019. We will hire out our appraisal firm, and they'll tell us the kind of a building building construction cost indicator, and they'll tell us how much building costs have gone up in an area for that year. And so we will adjust the property coverage or the property value according to this ACH or our appraisal company, their values that they send to us. An appraisal, it's definitely not a safety inspection. It's not going to identify any property hazards, any perils, or anything of that nature. But it is really vital to helping us properly insure or properly cover counties, but also to protect county assets as well. So this is an example. So if you get on any property on the schedules, if you jump on any one of them, they're going to have a one-sheet appraisal. And on here, you can identify, it's really small, you can identify the flood zone that it's in. If it's in an A flood zone or an X or a C, and then it has some basic property information along with the values. So if you ever are curious on the value of a property, if it's in a flood zone area, you can jump on your schedules, and there's a little hover link above the, we call it a unique identifier number. Just click on that, and it'll pull this property appraisal up. You can also look at the full property appraisal under the main menu as well. And so let's see, there's our flood zones again. If you are if you do have a structure that is in a flood zone A, this is kind of the process. And I just put this up for informational purposes, but if you have any questions, just use me as a resource, and I can do all the research and the work for you. But first, we're going to determine if it's in a special flood hazard area. After that, you go through a process where it's kind of a second opinion, a second fact of whether or not that property is located. They get a little bit more specific. They use something called core logic, which is just a very accurate measure of if it's in a flood zone property or not, or zone or not. And then we go to pre-firm or post-firm. So firm is the flood insurance rate map according to FEMA. And so if you are the flood insurance rate map, each county has a certain year that FEMA came in and evaluated the county, and they determined the flood rate map. So if you have if your county, FEMA came through and did the flood insurance rate map in 1980, and you build a property on a flood hazard area in 1985, well, now you are going to need, in order to even get a quote, you're going to need an elevation certificate. And that elevation certificate, just like it says, it just measures how high up the structure is from the actual floodplain. And so we've run into that a few times where we do have to get an elevation certificate before we can even get a quote from the National Flood Insurance Program. So sometimes, occasionally, it could be in your county records. Perhaps they built the building and then they did that elevation certificate at the same time. That's our best bet. Otherwise, we will have to reach out to a surveyor, architect, or an engineer, and then purchase an elevation certificate. And I think the last time we did one for 2 buildings, and they were large buildings, I think it was $1,950 for the 2 buildings for an elevation certificate. And so that you have to get that if you're post-firm. So if you built that structure after they developed the rate maps. And then we do submit a quote, and then there's pay the premium and then begin the policy coverage. And I included that in there because I know there's a lot of talk about flooding throughout the state. And so please again reach out to us. And like I said, a lot of you we have reached out to let you know, hey, this property is in a high risk area. And so let's see, any questions on flooding? No? Okay, last one. We do what we call a renewal affirmation. And every end of April, beginning of May, we send this document out. And it will have all of your schedules, your ATVs, all the way down to your watercraft. And is what we ask is just that you go through those schedules. And I know sometimes it's a big undertaking if you have a lot of, I'm sure a lot of you can vouch for that. And we sure appreciate all of the work that you do to get that accurate. And so, but we ask that you do that and make sure everything's up to date and current. And then just sign and send this back after you go through all these schedules. And so you should get an email from me probably about the end of April, just on that. Let's see here. That's it for that. The last question now, the UCIP board. How many? When did they vote this?
3 years ago.
It was 3 years ago. Okay, so this may not be new for many of you, but UCIP board voted to accept any qualifying county-related entities for UCIP membership or coverage. And so I know San Juan County has a water and sewer district, right? And a few others. So some of those, and here's a list of a few of them: your special service districts, your emergency medical service districts, down to your MBAs, health departments, fire districts, all of those. So one thing to keep in mind is as you have just these special service districts in your counties, just to make sure that they have coverage. Because sometimes the assumption could be, well, you know what, because they're it's somewhat tied to the county, it's going to be covered under UCIP coverage. And if they're a separate entity from the county, for instance, a special sewer district or an NBA, a lot of times they'll have a separate tax ID number. There's some indicators of them being separate from the county. You want to make sure that they're covered. If there's a lawsuit that comes through and they name the NBA and the county, well, if they're two separate ones, UCIP is covering the county, right? The NBA is not going to have coverage. Or a special service district. And so if you have some of those, again, feel free to reach out to us and we can kind of help with that. And so, you know what, I think we're at just about on time. So any questions at all?
Earthquakes.
Earthquake.
We cover those. Earthquake.
We do, yes. Corby, just standard property deductible,
Yep.
correct?
Yep.
Okay, so it's $500 deductible? It's $500
The
deductible.
cap on that would be,
Is it
I believe it's
250, 250? Is it that there's a
The cap
collective
on
cap,
earthquake?
right?
on earthquake. I believe it's 50 million.
Is it 50?
So in your case, in Iron County, it's more than the total values of all the buildings.
right, so, but that's a total we can do per county, right? It was 50 million.
Per loss.
Per loss.
Yes. So if you have an earthquake in the spring and an earthquake in the fall, two separate limits available. And with earthquake particularly, but flood too, remember that the earthquake covers damage that's caused by the shaking of the earth. Sometimes, many times, especially with earthquake, that shaking then causes the sprinklers to go off and you fire, flood the building, or gas main breaks and you burn down the building. That's all covered on the property, which is full replacement cost. So your earthquake limit really only needs to cover the amount of damage, structural damage caused by the shaking of the earth. If any ensuing covered loss occurs, that comes out of the earthquake limit and is provided under the full replacement cost. So at this point, the only building we worry about is the huge Weaver County law enforcement complex, which is right about $50 million of value.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, all right, thank you.